Okay, good morning, evening, and afternoon, everyone, depending on your time zone. And thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to mention that we have the Q&A feature and the chat feature that you can use. If at any point you have questions, we'll have time for questions at the end of the talk. The closed captioning feature is also enabled if you want to use that. We also wanted to remind everyone that if you want to suggest future speakers for this webinar series, we have a suggestion form on our website, and I will include the link to that in the chat. So without any further ado, I want to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Ylona van Dinther received her doctorate from ETH Zurich, where her work focused on the bridging of timescales and numerical models. For this work, she has been awarded the Jason Morgan Early Career Award from the American Geophysical Union. She has now been at Utrecht University since 2018, where her research principally aims at better understanding the tectonic and rheological controls governing the spatial temporal occurrence of fault slip. We're very excited to have her here, and thank you again. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me start by sharing my screen here. Yes, so welcome. Good morning, afternoon, and evening indeed. Thank you very much for inviting me. I've been working a lot the last years on induced seismicity and data assimilation as well. So I'm very excited to get back to the subduction zone hazards and things I worked on for a long time during my PhD, postdoc lectureships. And I kept on working on it a little bit with master students and 2 PhD students that have now started in a project on continental collision zones. So also convergence, but with 2 continents colliding. So the master students and PhD students that I highlight in bold here are the ones that did the hard work for this. So thank you very much for that. And let's see and go on this journey across space and time scales to see how these processes can inform earthquake hazards. So a big part of my research and my view respond to getting a holistic understanding of interactions across the crust, lithosphere, and the mantle in one system that always interact together and depend on each other, and also across timescales from their collision and subduction down to milliseconds. So how do these processes affect each other, and how can that help us understand hazard and parameters? So in this presentation, I want to focus on a few things and aim to give you an understanding of how structures and processes that are above and below the slab. I don't have a pointer here, but you see the slab, the oceanic plate. There's seamounts on top, there's upwellings from the bottom, there's the asthenosphere around it. So there's all these structures and processes there that we very often ignore or simplify. So with this, in this presentation, I want to see how that matters and what are we missing if we're just predefining certain motions, geometries, or stresses in a much simpler way here. So I'll start off by looking at splay faults in the start of the accretionary wedge here, and look then at seamounts, and then we go to what's happening below the slab. So to mantle upwellings there, and to processes in the elastic slab and overriding mantle. So how do these structures and processes above and below the slab affect deformation? I'm going to use mainly models to determine that. So I'm first going to show you the methodology for this, and that we can now actually fully bridge the timescales from really the millions of years to milliseconds. I can finally say, yes, we can completely bridge all of this. And with those models, we're then going to look at splay fault ruptures. How often do these splay faults that are present rupture? Then we go to seafloor roughness, and the sub-slab density anomalies that we have observed in Cascadia. And lastly, we end in Tohoku in Japan, where we try to fit both inter-seismic and post-seismic observations at the same time. And I want to show you that they inform us about the processes within the slab and the parameters below the slab. So first, starting off with this bridging of timescales. So fault slip can be approached from the earthquake perspective with milliseconds. But what is happening there is preceded over various timescales by other processes that determine the stresses and the strengths that are of relevance. So then if we continue that, we come into the realm of tectonics or geodynamics, where people also model fault slip, but then continuous fault slip without going into separate episodes. So earthquake ruptures themselves, their nucleation, their propagation, and their arrest is governed by fault stresses and strengths. So brittle and elastic rheologies are very important. Also viscous for a more limited extent here. And what matters if you want to understand where earthquakes occur are also interactions with other earthquakes, because the stress drop during an earthquake increases stresses surrounding that and determining thereby where the next earthquakes will occur. So if we extend the timescales and we go to sequences of earthquakes, we also add the loading leading up to that event and the post-seismic relaxation after that event. Now, I want to take a minute to look at this inter-seismic loading because I think it is critical. I mean, in a way, also logically, where you're loading the fault is going to determine where it is also going to rupture, and in part, how it is going to rupture. So we often, in models, have to make simplifications in space terms. So we're using 1D or 2D models to approximate 3D processes. So my PhD student, Meng Li, did a careful analysis of how we can compare these models across dimensions. And one of the things he found is that if we simply correct only the loading rate, we can actually simulate the recurrences and the observations during earthquakes very well, also on lower dimensional models. So he has a nice quantitative formulation on that. So if you're interested in how to use and go across timescales for papers that you're using or across the spatial dimensions, then take a look at this paper. Now, of course, this is from a very classical paper that we've known very long, but also it shows very nicely that inter-seismic loading you also need to approach well in time. So in the bottom figure, you see that if you do this inter-seismic loading much faster, each of the earthquakes shown in form of slip contours come very often with very few slip. So that is actually much more important to do correctly even than a fully dynamic or a quasi-dynamic approximation that we make for the co-seismic part. And if you take the next step, then you can also see that where in space we have the presence of brittle and elastic rheologies will also much determine where you have your earthquakes and the slips. So this is then the connection where you see an example of where you see that how this geodynamic or the long-term timescales comes in, because we will have ruptures only on the brittle parts here. So if we have more brittle connections, we'll have larger earthquakes there. So that's the step towards the tectonophysics or geodynamics realm, where the forces from plate tectonics determine the temperature, structures, the geometry of faults, the geometry of surrounding lithologies, and these are all the key parameters that determine the loading of stresses and the absolute strength on faults. So now we've actually completely bridged these timescales. So long ago, at the start of my PhD, I started with these geodynamic models, the thermomechanical models in 2D, finite difference marker and cell technique, where we define the initial geometry. So on the left bottom, you see two continents in gray and an ocean in between. We define how quickly they go and move towards each other. And we give each of the different materials that we include the viscous, the elastic, and the plastic parameters or brittle parameters that we measure in the laboratory. Then we solve for conservation of mass, momentum, and energy or heat in order to build the whole continent over millions of years, thereby defining the geometry of the system and of the faults, viscosities, temperatures, stresses, sometimes also fluid pressures. So we have the basics where we can start from and go down towards earthquakes. So I want to take just a moment to, on the long term, how we simulate these faults or this brittle response do we mimic by Drucker-Prager plasticity. So that means that at a single point, for example, here on the red star, when deformation localizes, when the stress, the second invariant of the deviatoric stress, reaches the pressure-dependent yield strength. So if that happens at a single point, we decrease the viscosity locally, such that the stress does not exceed the strength, and that allows for movement across these faults. And that way we can build faults spontaneously according to the surrounding stresses, and we have fault growth automatically and spontaneously. So we can evolve our faults. And if we do that, we zoom into small time scales, then we can also spontaneously simulate the nucleation, propagation, and arrest of earthquakes. So we add inertia, a rate-dependent or a rate and state-dependent friction criteria, and then we can simulate earthquakes. So for a few of the models that I will show, and the first ones that we had, we used a strongly slip rate-dependent friction, which is relevant for the very fast part of the earthquake, where you have a 1/velocity decrease of the friction coefficient. We go down to time steps of about 1 to 5 years, and we calculate the slip rate in this formulation from the strain rate, the plastic part of the strain rate that we have here, which we multiply by the grid size, which is a representation here for fault width. By taking these very long time steps, we don't resolve exactly the event, but we approximate the slip locations, as I will show in a bit. And then Robert Herrendorfer implemented also rate and state friction and adaptive time stepping in this still invariant formulation, such that we are able to resolve inter-seismic, co-seismic, post-seismic processes. And we can reach seismic slip rates. So that's been going on for a while. And if you then zoom into only the dynamic earthquake ruptures, you can see seismic wave propagation. You can see nicely evolving faults. So here you can see once the nucleation size is reached over the black line, then you go dynamic and you change the fault angle slightly according to the changes in stresses. So we resolve milliseconds and seismic wave propagation as well, essentially giving us a tool for viscoelastoplastic earthquake sequence models. Now we've worked quite a bit also on the numerical side of this, also in relating to induced seismicity. And there, Mozen Godazi developed a consistently linearized reformulation of that rate and state friction. And he carefully tested that against a discrete finite element model. So the result of that you see in the bottom figure, where you see that the slip rates at the point at the fault are very similar in our continuum approach as compared to the reference approach that uses a discrete fault. So because we have a continuum, you can measure the slip rate in the center of the node or at the edge of the node. So you have a small variation there, but together you see that captures the slip rate very nicely. So we also have a convergence with the grid size for only strain rate related qualities. So Mosen went further and also obtained fault width convergence using phase field methods, which is very nicely described in the paper you see cited on the bottom. But those solutions are really much more expensive. So this extensive study in the end showed us that Robert Herrendorf's invariant solutions were already very robust and actually very cost efficient as well. So once we refrain from things where fault width matters, such as for fluids, and we just focus on the strain rate, which is essentially everything we mostly care about, then we are fine. So Alexander Kulzer is doing his PhD now, and he really finalized all of the bridging of time scales from millions of years down to milliseconds in a fully dynamic way. So in the figure, the movie on the left here, you see the long term where we have a continent on the right in gray and an ocean with a green crust on the left. So over millions of years, we subduct the lithosphere. And once we reach a stable situation, we go down in time steps. We need to already have the state variable solved for, and then we can simulate sequences of dynamic earthquake ruptures. So here you see the first event and the dynamic waves that are admitted here, both in the velocities and in the strain rate, while the bottom panel shows you the change in stress with respect to the start of the event. So you see the dynamic stress changes still from the waves propagating through, as well as the static stress changes throughout the entire lithosphere. So this can go on for a while, but I'm going to show you more in depth what is happening here. So one reason why we would really like to go to dynamic simulations rather than quasi-dynamic simulations in subduction zones is that when we compared our first STM models and coupled them to SISL to simulate earthquakes using a fully dynamic earthquake rupture code, Iris van Zijlst found that the seismic waves that are trapped in the sedimentary wedge keep bouncing back between the free surface and the oceanic lithosphere, bam, 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 and thereby keep reactivating the fault and increasing slip at the shallow portion of the megathrust by a factor 3. And so if you compare the two figures on the right, where you see the spatial temporal evolution of the slip rates, you see that adding all the reflections from the variation in elastic parameters and densities across this system adds a lot of reflections into the system. And if you look at the purple line at the bottom, you see that the slip moves a lot more up dip. So the peak slip location is now up dip, and there it's about 3 times larger than what it was if you do not account for these reflections. So these trapped waves, we see exactly the same in our SCM rate and state friction model. So I show you now on the same color scale, you see the blue waves the blue motions that are trapped inside the wedge. And you see that our slip rates are on the same order of magnitude, but for this specific event, they're about 3 times lower. But I have to note, we're just doing a quick and dirty comparison with SISL. The friction laws are different, linear slip weakening versus our rate and state friction. The parameters are completely different. So we are not tuning this for exact comparison. We just want to get some information on how we are doing here. So the old STM results are shown in black here for the amount of slip. And for the rate and state friction, the newly bridge result, we show both small and large events. And you also see this increase in slip at the shallow portion of the fault. So if we put the diagrams on slip rates that we had next to the ones that we saw for the STM models, on the left top, we have the ones that are not resolved, that served as input directly for the SISL models on the right. So we saw similar nucleation and arrest locations, but many orders of magnitude lower slip rates, while the left bottom in the rate and state friction shows our current reference model. So there you see that the duration is comparable. Ours is maybe a little bit longer, but same, very similar slip rates up to a factor of 3, as I said. And interestingly, we see that on the bottom of the down dip limits, so on the right side of the diagram, in the seisal simulations, we don't see much higher slip rates, while in both the STM models, we see at least as high slip rates in the down dip going branch as in the up dip going branch here. So we also see in the left bottom figure that we have a very heterogeneous high slip rate. So we have a lot of heterogeneities present there in the subduction channel, both lithological and rheological, because some rocks go more quickly through their brittle ductile transition than others. And you see a lot of reflections coming through to that. Oh, let's go back to our nice figure that we are looking at here. Yes. So we do see nice high frequency patterns there at the bottom. If we look more to the left diagram, we do see that there's more smoothing in our models that would reduce the slip rates a little bit. Might be a possible explanation for that. So if we compare the stress drops for our old STM model and the new rate and state friction models, we see that the stress drops are fairly comparable in size and also in distributions to a large extent. And even though we haven't tuned these earthquakes to be exactly comparable, we see the large comparabilities suggesting maybe that the recurrence times could be comparable if our stress drops are. So Simon Preuss did a long time ago a bit better comparison of trying to tune the friction parameters in the strongly slip rate dependent friction versus the rate and state friction. And there you can compare the gray line in the background with the yellow bright green line, where you see that you have sort of similar stress drops and recurrence intervals are a little longer in the STM ones, but not so much. So overall, even though we don't resolve any parts of the co-seismic or post-seismic earthquakes very well in the STM model, still you can have a lot of reasonable information that you get out of those models. So if we go now first to the fully dynamic results, we want to look into splay faulting. We've looked at this, Iris van Zelst looked at that in continuation of her study when coupling STM and the seisal models. And there she found that if you couple that event, all the 6 splay faults that she transferred into seisal as well were all activated by the highly dynamic rupture that propagated over the megathrust. Now, if we look over tens of thousands of years, we see that many splay faults are active. We even see their advection through time. This is why they look a little bit more broad here. So over large time scales, many faults, splay faults are also active. But what happens in an earthquake cycle where everything is not defined and spontaneously evolving? Alexander Kulzer found that very often there's one main splay fault that is activated during the dynamic rupture. And that same splay fault is often re-ruptured in subsequent events as well. But the extent of co-seismic slip onto the splay fault depends on the size of earthquakes. The rest of that portion of the splay fault mostly experiences post-seismic slip. Although if co-seismic, post-seismic slip is not present, also inter-seismically, that large dominant splay fault will rupture. So especially if we have small slow slip events beneath, that inter-seismically, that large splay fault will also rupture. So if you look not at a single event over 20 seconds, but over 3 cycles of dynamic earthquakes, you see that some other splay faults, smaller ones, also light up and also slip, often during the inter-seismic period, but sometimes also co-seismically or post-seismically. So obviously this division between how much slip and what type of slip would occur depends on the friction parameters and particularly also the pore fluid pressure that we use. So if we would apply more velocity strengthening, because these are in sediments at low temperatures, so they are velocity strengthening. If we strengthen them more, you'll have more slower slip, more post-seismic slip. If we change pore fluid pressures, we would have, and lower them, we would have less co-seismic slip. And as I said, if we have more slower slips in the seismogenic zone, we also have more inter-seismic slip on the splay faults to make sure that the overall deformation is still accommodated. So it's about a quarter on this really large splay fault that you see lighting up, and about 3/4 on the megathrust in these settings. So overall, summarizing things, you have multiple active splay faults, but co-seismically, there's one really that dominates, that is about an order of magnitude stronger than the rest. And often that one is ruptured. So let's go to another topic on seafloor roughness, where we use the original STM models that have timestamps of 1 year, although we have done them as well on for millisecond timescales. So Maaike Fontijn here in her master thesis wanted to study these seamounts, but we first had to get the seamount at the accurate location. So that wasn't too easy. So we've identified the conditions on when we can have the seamount subducting and when it accretes to the front of the accretionary prism as shown in the bottom figure. Now look at observations from seismicity. Nowadays, seamounts are often seen also as barriers. So if we have smooth interfaces without seamounts and other aspects on it, you can have larger ruptures as proposed by Kaylin Wang and Bilek in 2014. But still we have also variable observations, right? Sometimes seamounts are suggested to be barriers, sometimes asperities. So we wanted to understand better what was happening there. So Maaike Fontijn implemented the seamount right on top of the oceanic plate. And then we subduct that margin for millions of years and see what happens on the megathrust. So in order to subduct that seamount, it needs to be strong. So in the left top of the diagram, you see here the weaker models that have higher pore fluid pressures, lower cohesions. In that case, you see that the seamount is often scraped off and much is accreted at the front of the prism. And that's also observed sometimes in observations as here in Barbados. So if we make it a little stronger, the seamount subducts, but also flattens a lot, such that we wouldn't see clear seismic imaging where we have seamounts sticking out. So if we want to keep that seamount largely intact, we need to use cohesions that are 20 megapascal or larger, and pore fluid pressures that are equal to or lower than 0.8. So I show you also the strain rates. So the viscoelastic strain rate for each of these cases. So if you have a seamount that's subducting more intact, you have more faulting throughout the wedge, as already proposed in the scenarios by Wang and Bilek. And here we quantify and we show that. So you see the movie ongoing of the reference model that we will show. So as the seamount subduct, you see the splay folds surrounding that seamount. So if we look through time on the x-axis and space on the y-axis, where the trench is located above, you see quasi-periodic recurrences of large earthquakes throughout the seismogenic zone. So at the left is the reference model for a smooth interface, so very similar to models that we already had. Nucleation is indicated by the stars just up dip of the down dip limit of the seismogenic zone defined by the brittle ductile transition. And on the right, you see the same diagram, but then from the model that started after this seamount was subducted until the center of the seismogenic zone or a bit deeper. So now if you look at the stars, you see that the nucleation location shifted a bit more upwards, actually right to the bottom of the seamount. And you see many more smaller events indicated in blue that are occurring in this sequence. So actually also in the wake of the seamount. So that is the top of the figure is where there is no longer a seamount. It's just where a seamount has been and has shaken up the stress structure and the fault structures that are there in the accretionary prism. So then we also see many more smaller earthquakes occurring there. So interestingly, we found that actually subducting this seamount over geological times is important because it modifies the slip location and the behavior of an asperity or a barrier. So in this figure, I show you the results for a smooth interface, and the color indicates how often a certain cell has ruptured. So you see the dark black patches you see most frequently ruptured inside the seismogenic zone in between the isotherms of 150 and 350 degrees indicated in white in this figure. Now, if we subduct the seamount to the location that you show here, you see that the black dots and where you have most of the rupture shifts to the top of the seamount and actually no longer in the deeper part of the seismogenic zone. So actually beneath the seamount, in front of it, you see much less slip. And also in the wake of the seamount, you also see less frequent slip. So here, the seamount really turned into a asperity where it focuses most of the slip to occur on top of the seamount. Now, originally, we also just wanted to simply define the seamount and impose the seamount. Okay, here, we know the seamount is here, we put it there, but it hasn't evolved over millions of years, and it didn't imprint any of the stresses. So we did that because that would be the easiest thing to do. But interestingly, you see that in the deeper part of the seismogenic zone, you still have a lot of times that the fault ruptured. So the seamount itself is not as much an asperity as when it has subducted over geological times. So in the bottom figure, you see mostly changes in the slip behavior due to the geometry of the seamount, but nothing related to the stress changes or pressure changes in surrounding the seamount. So if you look at the hypocenter locations, you also see that that is much affected. Previously, you have many earthquakes nucleating above the down dip limit of the seismogenic zone. If you subduct that seamount, that switches to the deeper part of the seamount, where most earthquakes are then nucleated. So no longer near the down dip limit, but really at the tip near the first branch of upcoming on the seamount. So if we just impose that seamount, we don't see that clear change in hypocenter locations. We still have most of the hypocenter locations near the down dip limit of the seismogenic zone, so no specific concentration at the tip of the seamount. And we do see some activation there in splay faults, as we also see in the other model. But that's it, only geometrical changes, no stress imprint changes. So the seamount often acts as an asperity in these models, but we also found a few occasions where they do act as a barrier. So if you tilt the spatial temporal figure that we saw with all the lines of the earthquakes horizontally, you see here a blue line that nucleates, hits the seamount, and then stops. And particularly we see that the wake of the seamount now is much more frequently acting as a barrier here. So in the wake of the seamount, if you look at the bottom figure, the changes in pressure or mean normal stress have dropped in the wake of the seamount, while the pressures have increased in front of the seamount there. So even though we have an increase in pressure and an increase in strength, we also have much more faster increases of shear stress there, such that we still have preferred nucleation at the leading flank of the seamount. So that showed us that seamounts need to be studied and the seismicity that to produce mostly through subducting that seamount over millions of years. Then we go to Cascadia. So we add some data set and compare to what observations have suggested. So this is the work from Vince Hazard, and he studied what processes can explain segmentation in Cascadia along strike. So can that be explained by sub-slab densities or slab age variations? So the sub-slab buoyancy hypothesis has been proposed by Miles Bodmer and others. And here you see the logic for that. So on the left panel, you see the low velocity anomalies beneath the slab at 100 kilometers depth and below. So you see two distinct mantle upwellings in the northern section of Cascadia and in the southern section of Cascadia. And if you then look at one locking model, you seem to see variations of locking across strike as well that might agree with the mantle upwelling locations that we have seen. So also if you look at tremor densities, but also topography and other aspects, you see this segmentation in a northern section, a central section, and a southern section. So they suggest that this is due to the buoyancy acting beneath the slab here. So under the slab, in the north and the south, you have a mantle upwelling that is pushing the slab interface upwards and the topography upwards. So we tested that, and we also tested alternative hypotheses for this segmentation, which are the variations in slab age along strike that you see here correlate nicely to also the elevation and the topography. So we used our STM models where we impose a buoyant anomaly beneath the slab. Then we adapted the configuration, the slab ages to the Cascadia margin, and we simulate this for 8 million years, up to the point where you have the density anomaly that is shown in the bottom figure, surrounded by the black line. And we see how that impacts the topography and the slab profile. So you see increases of the buoyancy contrast in lighter colors, in more light reddish colors. So you see if you impose stronger buoyancy contrasts, the slab, particularly at geodynamic depths of 70, 80, 90 kilometers, indeed shallows from this push from the bottom. You see that quantified in the left bottom diagram here. Although I have to note that it's the initial density contrast that is shown. So the effective density contrast at the 8 million years we are looking at is a lot smaller and is shown approximately in parentheses. So if we look at the topography, we also see that indeed this push from beneath the slab translates into a higher topography. And for our favorite choices of buoyancy contrast, this is indeed about 1 kilometer if we extrapolate everything. Now, if we look at inter-seismic coupling in these different models, what we see is, well, we needed to think about it a little longer. It wasn't as easy as originally proposed, but what happens is because of this push at geodynamic depths, and the shallowing is actually unbending the slab at seismogenic depths that are shallower, and thereby reducing normal stresses in the seismogenic zone. Which updip means that because you have lower strengths, you also have more plastic creep, so lower inter-seismic coupling. And which downdip means that if you have lower stresses in your dislocation creep formulation, you also have higher viscosities. So lower viscous strain rates and also lower inter-seismic coupling. Okay. Not sure why that doesn't work, but let's look at the comparison with the data here. You see in the locking model on the left, indeed, that in the northern section and the southern to some extent, at the shallow parts, you have lower coupling, while at the deeper parts, you indeed have higher coupling. So we also studied the seismicity in these different models. So if you want, you can go far with interpretations and say that you see more heterogeneous seismicity with higher rates of very smaller earthquakes, as would be seen also in the northern and the southern Cascadia. But I think it's, yeah, you see, but it's not very clear interpretation of that. And our simulations didn't have the full size of the anomaly because we spontaneously created that. So if we extrapolate to the right size of the anomaly, according to a few simulations that we did, we can also quantitatively explain the variations in slab dip and in topography. So without needing any variations in slab age. So we did the same study for variations in slab age. I will spare you the details, but you can read it in our paper that I hope we'll soon submit. But some explanations can work in the slab age, others cannot, and it depends a bit on which slab age model that you take. But altogether, slab age variation can only explain a part of the observations. So we favor the explanation with sub-slab buoyancies because we really see that those processes translate into the observations that we have seen at the surface. So the last topic, if we go into, we go to Tohoku, and we actually integrate and really assimilate surface observations into models. So we want to integrate observations before the Tohoku earthquakes, so the 10 years before inter-seismically, and after the Tohoku earthquake. So rather than what we traditionally do, invert either the inter-seismic velocities or the post-seismic velocities, try to fit both and see which parameters match both observations, because then we'll have more observations to accurately constrain our parameters. So the forward model, or the model that we use, is not the STM model that we've been using up to now, but another model that is has more of this heterogeneous structures, viscous and elastic structures, and also a bit more of the mechanics from the STM model, but fully describes the slip, the co-seismic slip on the fault over series of many earthquakes that would have preceded the Tohoku earthquake. And then in this model, we want to estimate the pre-exponent factor, A, and the activation energy, E, in the power law rheology of the mantle, both the mantle wedge and what is beneath the slab, and in the shear zone beneath the seismogenic zone in red. So to do that, we use data assimilation. So traditional data assimilation in terms of ensemble Kalman filtering works as shown in the cartoon here. So we have a model, physics-based, forward propagating in time, and that is then corrected towards the truth, which also has an error around it, leading to an analysis that is often in between these two, the model results and the observations. The observations we think are typically closer to the truth, but they are not exactly the truth because we always have an error in where we measure them, and we don't measure at the locations where we would like to measure. So once we have this improved location, we propagate forward in time again. And once we have new data coming in, we again assimilate that data into the model and determine an analyzed posterior which best meets both the model and the data constraints. And we keep doing that in time, hoping that we get closer and closer to the truth. Now, we are not using ensemble Kalman filtering, we're using an ensemble smoother. And the smoother part means that rather than only taking care of the data at one point in time, we also wanted to include the previous data and update the parameter estimates in the past. So this is done through an ensemble smoother with multiple data assimilation. And then you can look at the diagram at the bottom here, where we're also back propagating this information to update the parameter estimates. So if we look at the data fit, we see that we fit the horizontal velocities very well. And the vertical velocities are always more difficult, but capture part of the trends, particularly in the post-seismic period, although some processes are definitely missed also here when having a quite advanced forward model as well. So if we look at the posterior distributions of each of the parameters that I plot around this diagram here, you see, if you analyze them a bit more, that they're often in line with laboratory estimates if we have them available. So for example, if you look at the bottom, the pre-exponent that we have in both of the sections above and below the slab, you see that there's a trade-off between the values of these two parameters. But this trade-off and the possible values also nicely go through the estimates of the laboratory of Herf and Kolstad. So together, with the laboratory and the data estimates, we could have nice indications of what these parameters should be. So one of the things that we can do with this system once we have done data assimilation is that we can look at and quantify what processes are responsible for different parts. So in post-seismic deformation, we can explain things both from afterslip as well as from viscoelastic relaxation. So if we look at the correlation between the parameters that we estimate for afterslip and in the mantle, we see that the correlation is very low. And that suggests that each of these parameters have a unique and identifiable footprint onto the velocities at the surface. So one of the implications of doing this more mechanically consistent approach, also with more data that we solve for, is that the viscosity that we estimate underneath the slab, so as you see in the figures on the right, is quite a bit lower than what is needed in other very nice state-of-the-art inversions of the same data. So in order to explain the landward movement of in the early post-seismic period near the trench, quite a few studies need very low viscosities beneath the slab in the order of 10 to the 16, 10 to the 17 in the days after the earthquake. But for us, even directly after the earthquake, we can do with viscosities of 7 times 10 to the 18 Pascal second. And that is because a part of those landward motions near the tip of the trench are due to a second process that is included in these models because we simulate kinematic cycles over many times. So essentially we have built up elastic motions because the slab was locked, as you see in the left top figure, in the inter-seismic period, while subduction was ongoing. So subduction was inhibited. But when, during the earthquake, that locking was released, fast motion of the slab occurred, but not all of that can occur directly in the post-seismic period because you also have the surrounding resistance from the mantle. So a part of that is still released in the early post-seismic period, still moving also the slab and a part of the trench towards the land here. So Celine Maasman calls this the recovery motions that she also quantifies if you compare that to simulations where you have subduction occurring without any resistance or coupling. So with free slip along the megathrust. So then you see that you do have here between 50 and 0 kilometers, you have a bit of these enhanced landward motions of the slab. So altogether, we discussed quite a few structures and processes that affect deformation that occur above the slab and below the slab. So I think if we want to have a correct process understanding, we need to account for some of those. And also if we want to correctly quantify parameters, such as the viscosity or processes or seismic hazards, we need to be aware of what is happening here and either include them or think about how to translate those motions. So we can bridge from millions of years to milliseconds, finally. And if we do that, we see that multiple splay faults are active over a sequence of earthquakes, although one dominates strongly, and often that one is ruptured to variable extents. And then if we subduct seamounts, we see that that stress imprint of that subduction pattern distinctly affects the seismicity, nucleation location, and segments the megathrust a bit, making that seamount an asperity and introducing more barriers and less slip in the wake of that seamount and ahead of that seamount. So if we look at the segmentation in Cascadia, we think you can best explain that by sub-slab densities anomalies of mantle upwellings that are present in the north and in the south, because these upwellings increase the slab dip and the topography, and the unbending involved explains inter-seismic coupling. And finally, in Tohoku, we also see that simulating the behavior of that slab affects our estimates of processes explaining surface velocities and the viscosity magnitudes that we estimate in this beneath that slab. So all that was done via master students and a bit of PhD students, but now I have funding for 2 big projects such that we can extend the vision that I have for one earthquake system, accounting for plate tectonics, faults, and mantle, also in an inverse modeling approach, because we have new data that confirm the predictions that were made by these STM models before those data arrived. So for example, in the left top figure, you see the secondary zone of subsidence in Cascadia, but also now observed in Japan, that was predicted by the flexure and the mantle motions in the STM models. And using new techniques for GPUs, we really want to make the step to also you make adjoint-based inversions of this integrated system approach, and also combining data before, during, and after earthquakes. So that will help us a lot in the inferences of processes and earthquakes. It's a lot of work, but there's many positions here. So if you're interested or you know somebody that is interested, please drop me an email. I will open the first PhD and postdoc positions next month, or in a week, hopefully. So thank you very much.
Thank you for such a great talk. We already have a few questions, so I think we should go ahead and jump in. The first 3 questions are from Tian Haoje's son. He says, thanks for a great talk and very nice modeling work. The first question is, in your STM RSF model, what strategy did you use to prescribe these down dip high slip rate asperities? What physical and geological processes in your mind do those represent?
So I guess you are talking about these asperities that are triggered. So I don't fully understand the question, but I'm just going to give it a try and let me know if you want to know more. So in our models, we also subduct sediments here along with basalt and different parts of sediments. So we have different lithologies at depth here. And those all change to feature viscous deformation at different temperatures. So here we have quite a large viscosity contrasts in different pieces. And we simulate that with the technologies and the implementations that I briefly explained here for rate and state friction. So this is what we did for the long-term part. And then for the shorter-term part, we are varying the friction coefficient here according to, I implemented that quickly without a lot extra there, but then we can simulate also friction coefficients if we calculate slip rates from the strain rates that we have. So we're always calculating strain rates, and then we can calculate the slip velocities from that. So if you want to know exactly how to do that, I suggest you look into this paper from Robert Herrendorfer in 2018, where that is exactly explained. So that is done for a strike slip model there, but everything is the same in the subduction zone models here in terms of the implementation of the calculation of the friction coefficients.
Thank you. We have another question. Did the earthquake rupture in your model eventually localize to a thin shear zone? If so, why does the static stress drop show a lot of surrounding fault heterogeneities?
Yes, so it essentially always localizes to one, at most 2 grid cells. So you see very thin faults, or thin, well, for me, in the whole large scale model, they're thin. For most of the people, they're still very thick. fault zones because we have grid sizes of 100 or a few hundred meters. So here you see the stress drop pattern. So what was the second part of the question in relating to the stress drop pattern?
If so, why does the static stress drop show a lot of surrounding fault heterogeneities?
Yeah, so you see a lot of things happening here around. So this is all what has accumulated also over millions of years and over time scales, because we have a slab here that is bent. If a slab wants to bend, it's also brittle. So you have normal faults that arise there. So these stripes that you see here are those normal faults, and the stress memory of those faults is maintained. So that is simply advected with the model. So you see increased stress changes inside the fault zones of those normal faults here in the shallow part, and a decrease here in the deeper parts. And then you see the neutral stress interface here in the middle of the fault, where we change from extension in the outer part of the bend to compression in the inner part of the bend here. So there's no lithological heterogeneities there, but there's variation in the stress history and the stress state of the bending slab here. And similar things can explain the other observations here on the top of the slab.
Thank you. Another question, in the seamount subduction case, if less slip down dip or up dip of the seamount, then how does those portions of the megathrust balance the long-term slip budget? There doesn't appear to be much off-fault damage surrounding these fault segments.
And so we haven't analyzed that in detail, but the more obvious answer would be that maybe that occurs aseismically. But yeah, we haven't quantified that part. We have the inter-seismic coupling, but not at this level of detail to know that.
Thank you. And then one last question from Keelan Wang. He says, great talk regarding barriers versus asperities, e.g. associated with subducting seamounts. What is the size of the earthquakes that you are referring to? Numerous small and medium-sized events are akin to creep, correct?
So the color here is shown showing the magnitude, but I have to note it's a 2D model, right? So we use empirical scaling relationships to go from 2D to 3D. So the very large ruptures that occur here are, in this case, magnitudes 8.5. And the smaller earthquakes that particularly occur in the seamount model, they are still fairly large ones, like magnitude 7.5. Ish, and magnitude 7's event in that case. So much lower we cannot resolve. So with the grid size that we use.
Thank you very much. If anyone else has any questions or comments for Ylona, please feel free to let us know, and we will make sure that they get to her. But let's please give her another big round of virtual applause. And I know we're a couple minutes past the top of the hour, so without further ado, we will let everyone get back to their very busy days. So thank you again.
Have a
That
good
was
day.
an excellent talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, all.
Bye-bye.